This is TWiT.
I think we should go to Canada.
Yeah, I think it was time. It was time to. I mean, I've mentioned Canadian whiskeys on the show before, but I thought, in part of our Understanding Whiskey series, and we've talked. Obviously, we spent a lot of time. Although I understand the video is just about ready on Scottish whiskey. They're going to actually put up that playlist.
Yay!
And then I talked about American and the differences there, and we talked about Japanese and the differences there, and then we talked about Irish and the differences there. So we should talk about Canadian, because Canadian whiskey has been around for a couple hundred years. It's distinct. It has some very unusual attributes I think you'll enjoy. But I don't know that you can really grapple with Canadian whiskey if you don't really grapple with Canada. So that's why I put the flannel.
Canada.
So if we go back a bit, I mean, I'd be remiss not to start with the Indigenous peoples, right? Like Canada's been
the first
that
nation
land's been populated. First Nations, we're now finding through archaeological digs millennia of people living on the land, even before the Bering Strait at the end of the last ice age. Now we found even older peoples that were on the land.
That's so cool. That's very cool.
That there were cities built in North America before Europeans arrived. They collapsed for various reasons. Famously, in the 1960s, we found Lance Meadows. This is that little part in northern Newfoundland where the Vikings actually established a colony for a period, and then discovered, hey, there are very capable Indigenous people and they don't like us very much, and they moved on. At least that's the proposal. I remember reading a translated document of the Viking efforts working their way across the North Atlantic, getting to Greenland, Iceland and Greenland and so forth. And they describing an Inuit. And at the time, of course, the Inuit are these seafaring people using kayaks and mostly sealskins and so forth. So an Inuit in a kayak is all one piece. And the Viking didn't quite understand that's a guy in a boat. He's just like, this was a funny looking creature. He had head and arms, but had this thing. But it ends with, I poked him with a spear and he bled a lot like a person, but not the same. Because that's how you communicate with people. Great strategy.
They're like the Harley Davidson guys from but with boats.
Exactly. So fast forward to the 1500s, the French and the English are exploring and colonizing and interacting with the native peoples. In fact, the only walled city in all of North America is Quebec City. At the end of the St. Lawrence Seaway, which on that side is all salt, even though it's a part of a river, the first choke point where it gets narrow enough and really becomes the St. Lawrence River, that's where they built their very first city, and it was defending the entrance to the St. Lawrence Seaway. And so much production and development. The English controlled more of the upper part of the waterway, and they were big on taking sugar out of the Caribbean, and they would bring it up to those lands to actually process into rum. And, things come to a head in 1755 with what is known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. But in North America, it was known as the French and Indian War. And this is the war, by the way, that trained a lot of American military for getting ready for the Revolutionary War a few years further on.
Are you taking credit for this? No, is that what I just heard? Just
letting you know, like this is these histories are intertwined, as are the whiskeys, right? Famously, this is also as the English are winning in these conflicts. They start trying to push the French out, who are refusing to acquiesce to George II, which you folks didn't want to do either. And that's the Acadians that get pushed out in the chunks of land that are Maine and Nova Scotia and so forth, most of them will be sent back to France. And then when the French didn't want them, because it sucks to be a refugee, they actually made a deal and shipped a bunch of them to Louisiana. And those become the Cajuns.
My family stayed in Quebec, the Laportes, that we were the original part of that group.
And that really gets to the reality century. Of, at the end of that war and the Treaty of Paris, the end of that war, you have both French and Canadians, French and English living together. Even if their nations don't get along particularly well, they're just trying to survive. Colonies is a tough environment. And in the midst of all of this, it comes a young man named John Molson. And yeah, it's that Molson.
Yep.
He's a fifth son. His parents have died, although they were very well-to-do. So he has a trust fund. And as fifth sons do, he goes to the colonies. He has an education in brewing, and he starts working. He immigrates to Quebec City, and he starts running an existing beer operation, ultimately takes it over by 1785. Creates the Molson Company, which is now the second oldest company in all of Canada, predating Confederation itself, the oldest being the Hudson's Bay Company.
Yeah. Wow.
By 1791, we've split what will eventually be Canada. It's still not Canada, into what's called Upper and Lower Canada. Lower Canada being further north because directions are hard, and Upper Canada being further up the Ottawa River. I mean, eventually we'll call these Ontario and Quebec, but we're not there yet. And in one of the many trips that John Molson, being a successful brewer, is involved in, he brings some whiskey in from England and decides that this is pretty good stuff. And so decides to repurpose a British rum still to make whiskey from grain, wheat primarily. At the time, wheat crops were bumper. This is 1799. And so they were literally going to rot. And rather than let them rot, they fermented them and made them into pretty harsh whiskey. But it's the beginning of that. And that's in the Kingston, Ontario area, which is basically when you get to the end of the St. Lawrence River and it opens into Lake Ontario, that's where Kingston is. And so by 1801, they have a steady whiskey production. Now, whiskey is pretty successful. So a bunch of other companies jump on board. By the War of 1812, between the English and the Americans, the Canadians are happily selling beer and whiskey to both. Pretty quickly, Molson gets more focused on beer than whiskey. The big whiskey makers in Canada in the early 1800s were groups like Hiram Walker, which you'll know by their product Canadian Club, and Joseph Seagram's, who famously makes the Seagram's VO, although by the 1930s, they will make a very well-known whiskey.
Are you saying Hiram Walker and Seagram's are both Canadian?
They're Canadians, yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. The liquor barons.
Yeah. And in 1861, when the Civil War breaks out and you're all distracted from making your own booze, we happily sell it to you because that's the business. And by the time the Civil War is over, around the time that Canada actually becomes Canada, Confederation doesn't come till 1867. Our first set of rules for making whiskey come in 1875. And this is when they define Canadian whiskey. Now, at the time, Canadian whiskey was primarily made with wheat and corn because it's inexpensive. And they would add a little rye to it because it tasted good. And so most whiskey was referred to as either Canadian whiskey, Canadian rye whiskey, or rye whiskey, even though the rye only made a small portion of it. And to qualify as Canadian whiskey, it had to be mash distilled and aged in Canada and be at least 40% alcohol. Barrels no larger than 700 liters, and I'm going to stick with liters because Canada, get over it. Although they didn't have any requirement for charring or anything like that, you could use raw wood and a minimum of 3 years. So the specs are pretty loose. You could pretty much do what you want with Canada, and it would get crazier from there. One of the distinctive aspects of Canadian whiskey, which persists to this day, is that they would tend to distill and barrel each grain independently. So where the Americans with bourbon will make a mash bill, right, where they'll actually combine corn and rye and barley together, the Canadians would tend to do them separately and then use different barrelings for them to combine before they would actually combine them. They did, of course, use American bourbon barrels because the Americans, like crazy people, would only use their barrels once, and why waste a good barrel? In fact, the Canadian line was bourbon is the leftover stuff in a barrel now mature enough for Canadian whiskey. The other technique that Canadians to this day still do is they'll actually do split distillations and barrelings. So they'll use their grains, typically corn today, although more wheat back in the day, and they'll do a high distillation with that, get it up into the 70s, 80s, even 90s, then cut it with water and put it into the used bourbon barrels. That's that old 64% trick we talked about, where just slightly stronger than what American bourbon would use to pull new flavors out. But then they'd also use a low distillate, only 40 or 50%, a little more flavorful. And they put those in newer barrels, because if you put the high distillate in new barrels, you get very harsh flavors. But if you put low distillates in new barrels, you get good flavors and you mature the barrel as well. And then afterward, they would combine them together. And that is one of the things that makes Canadian whiskey distinct, is that they do these separate barrelings and then combining, although there are many ways to get about this that the Scots do and so forth with their combined barrelings. But the split distillation is a little more unusual. We got to talk about Prohibition. We're into the 1920s. Now, Canada flirted with Prohibition as well. You know, coming out of World War I, everybody's a little upset, something about a pandemic and so forth. And so a lot of drinking going on. Canada never had a national prohibition. Different provinces had different rules. But one of the things we never got around to was banning making booze, even when we did have Prohibition. We just couldn't buy it ourselves, but we'd happily sell it to somebody else. And even when Prohibition largely went away in Canada, it was still going on in the U.S. And so, being neighbors with the largest undefended border in the world, we supplied you a lot of booze.
Is that true? Really, the largest undefended border?
Undefended border in the world is Canada as an enabler.
Oh, 100%. And so
it's like my neighbor who's rail thin but bakes cookies every week.
Yeah,
they're pushers. They're pushers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, it looks like you're having a little civil war. How would you like some whiskey?
Yeah, we can help. We're here to help.
We got them.
And
we
so
make it here.
But in the early days of Prohibition, when pretty quickly, the U.S. came to Canada and said, hey, you really have to stop selling whiskey down here. So we made it illegal to sell whiskey to Americans, and did not want to break the law. What we'd do then is we'd load up ships full of our whiskey and we'd take them 3 miles offshore, which eventually got to be known as the rum line, because now it's in international waters, and then Americans would come and buy it perfectly legal from the Canadians. What they do with that, not our problem. So eventually they put a squash on that. It said, it has to be foreign exported only. You can only sell it foreign export. Well, that leads us to St. Pierre and Miquelon. So there's these 2 islands about 16 miles off the south coast of Newfoundland that are French. They're still French protectorates to this day. You get a stamp on your passport if you take the ferry across to them. So during the period of Prohibition, the Canadians would ship all of their whiskey to France. They'd ship it and they built these huge warehouses on these teeny little islands, exported all the booze to France, so totally illegal, taxed and everything. The French, of course, refused Prohibition in any respect because that's insane. Why would you do that? And then the Americans would buy it and do something with it. Nobody really knew.
Sure. Medicine, mostly.
We go somewhere. In 1930 alone, they figured 2 million gallons of whiskey flowed through St. Pierre.
Wow.
This tiny little island off the coast of Newfoundland that just was this. And for 10 plus years, everybody quit. It used to be a cod fishery, right? Everybody just was in the booze import export business.
What's the economy like there now?
A little rough, and the funny part, of course,
destination.
They went through a pretty serious depression. Of course, it was a depression also. Yeah. Then they did well in World War II because they were a good port. They're a good deep water port, and so they were needed for a bunch of things. But it took a while to get back into the fishing industry. It's mostly tourism there today. Wow. And by most standards, and I think the Walker folks still celebrate this, Canadian Club, the #1 most smuggled whiskey during U.S. Prohibition. Love it. So post-Prohibition, everybody's getting back into the business again. Apparently, there was a period there where American distilleries that were being rebuilt actually started bottling Canadian whiskey and calling it American because the Canadian stuff had more time to mature. And as protectionism came in the 1950s, they started making more rules about importing booze. They made an exception for the Canadians. They called it the 111 rule. So this was a U.S. Congress law that said, yes, we are going to tax imported booze unless 1/11th of it is American booze.
1/11th.
1/11th.
What a strange number.
And so what did the Canadians start doing? Well, the Canadians started buying inexpensive bourbon and tipping in a little bit of it into their barrels, and then they would have that tax exemption to sell into America.
Incredible.
Fast forward to 2009, and they recodified that rule. It's now called the 909 rule, or 9.09% rule, which, by the way, is 1/11th. The exact description is Canadian whiskey can be called Canadian whiskey if it's being exported. You're not allowed to use this for domestic consumption at a limit, and it's allowed to have up to 9.09% of imported spirits in it. But those spirits must be at least 2 years old. So you can't just dump corn grain alcohol into it. You can't mezcal in it, although there are some aged mezcals that now qualify, and a couple of nutty Canadian distilleries have done this. But here's the thinking. If I'm making a whiskey and I decide to age it in a bourbon cask, that bourbon cask is still wet with the bourbon in the wood. How much bourbon's in my whiskey anyway?
Right.
Or if I age it in a sherry cask. So let me introduce you to a whiskey you cannot buy. I'm just going to leave with that, not to upset you, called Alberta Premium Dark Horse Rye. It would have been my whiskey of the week if I could have laid my hands on it. It has not been available in ages. 90% of it, standard Canadian rye whiskey. They do that split aging. So the high distillate was 12-year, the low distillate was 6-year, and then they added 8% bourbon. It was likely Old Granddad that they bought in bulk and added to it, and then 1% sherry.
Wow.
So rather than buy the sherry cask, as expensive that is, and do a finishing in a sherry cask like everybody else did, I'll just tip a little sherry in it.
Yeah.
There you go. You've made yourself
now
the equivalent.
You said something interesting. You as a Canadian, you can't buy this.
No, as a Canadian, I can't buy it, and it was only made a few years ago. I've looked for it in exports. It's not available either. Yeah, if 909 whiskeys are for export only
thing. So they don't bother if you're buying it in Canada, it's 100% Canadian.
Yes, they don't do the 909 thing. It was all about for
taxes.
Export. Yeah,
but it's weird.
It's specifically American. Although the tax rules are gone. Like tax rules don't even exist anymore.
I think alcohol is the source of the weirdest.
It's appellations in general. Appellations and these arcane rules around what makes champagne, and what makes bourbon are so they're antiquated now because those tax laws are gone. And it's weird that you can't buy these in Canada. Would you want to? I mean, would you prefer to buy 909 in Canada or?
Yeah, why wouldn't you want to try this, right? I mean, I just love the idea of, hey, funny. If you finish this whiskey in a sherry cask, you get a little flavor of sherry. But why do you want to spend all that money on that cask? Let's just put some sherry in it. Thanks for playing.
I'm sure there is a difference, but okay.
Needless to say, Canadian whiskey is very popular in America, and it's the primary market for Canadian whiskey. In fact, the IRI reports from 2019, which is sort of the standard for this business, said the number one whiskey in America, Jack Daniel's, obviously. The number two, Crown Royal.
Yeah.
So
we
it's done very well
for cocktails. I mean, it's just
By the way, the number three was Fireball.
Fireball.
Which originally,
if you've given up totally, we recommend Fireball.
I also, it was some shame admit, a Fireball originally made by Seagram's in Gimli, Manitoba, acquired by the Sazerac distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky, is now made in Frankfurt, although they still use Canadian whiskey to make it.
Yeah, you have to hold the standard. What, Fireball? God damn it.
That's whiskey with cinnamon. With
number three.
In case you're under 21, it's cinnamon whiskey.
Oh, so gross.
And I love it because if you go to the Fireball site, all the other sites, they say, well, what's your birthday? Here they just go, are you 21?
Yeah. No, it's like the circle's not even centered.
This is how they brand Fireball. Crazy.
Yeah. I bet 90% of the sales of this, like the little bottles you get at checkout, you're like, I don't want anyone to know I'm drinking this. Just give me a little.
Well, I bet you number 5 is that peanut butter whiskey you drink, Paul, to be honest.
Sure.
Listen, so Canadian whiskeys don't go after awards. They go after their reasonably priced, good tasting whiskeys.
We're not going
they're not about awards season.
No, not a thing.
They're
not about awards. It's so Canadian.
No.
It's not about the awards.
But in 2016, Jim Murray, who's one of the most respected whiskey specialists in the world, named Crown Royal's Northern Harvest Rye the World Whiskey of the Year.
Wow.
And by the way, a very nice whiskey. And when you're going to go shopping for Crown Royal, either buy the original or buy this.
Yeah.
Leave all the rest alone. There's like apple versions and maple syrup versions, like some really bad things.
Right.
There's a dark that's pretty good. The traditional Crown Royal, you cannot go wrong with. A little ginger ale, you feel good about it. But here's the funny part. When Yamazaki won the gold medal in 2013, Yamazaki 12 went from a $40 bottle of whiskey to a $400 bottle of whiskey, if you could find one.
Right.
When Crown Royal started making Northern Harvest rye, it was $30. They won that award. You know how much it is today?
$30.
$30.
Yeah, good for them.
Right?
Because they're Canadian. We're not we're not awards.
Yeah,
I tell you again.
Good taste in whiskey that you don't feel bad throwing in a cocktail or drinking on its own. They're good either way.